Hello, I'm Tom Dignan, and this is TalkNado. Today we're going to be talking about current events that are important to our lives. And joining me on the show today, we have, here today are two of my favorite people, Ms. Musil and myself, and then also joining us is Mr. Fields. Yes, we're going to start talking about the 2016 presidential election. So first, general election as we're getting closer, we have candidates picked. Mr. Fields, what do you see as the biggest issue that these two parties will clash over when we come to the election in November?
I would say the biggest issue is going to be immigration. The Republicans, especially the leading Republican candidate, well, actually the only Republican candidate left, Donald Trump, has a very aggressive immigration policy involving mass deportations, the building of a wall on the United States' southern border. And Democrats, both Sanders and Hillary, support more of a amnesty program that would allow undocumented immigrants to stay in the United States. So I see that as the biggest issue.
I think that ISIS and national security is another thing that's going to be a major issue when it comes time for the debates. We have Donald Trump who's saying that he's going to go over there and kick their butts or whatever else, not necessarily giving quite yet how we're going to do that. Both sides have yet to really present a plan in that sense. But how they're going to be combated, it's going to be compared to how Obama did it, not putting boots on the ground, doing airstrikes. Should we be working with the Syrian government to stop ISIS? I think these are all things that are going to be questioned, and the new candidate or the candidates are going to have to answer for themselves whether or not they would support something a little bit more aggressive or do more of what Obama's doing, where we're not as committing as much to the Middle East.
Now, as we look at each of the parties, as you said, Mr. Fields, we now have one candidate. We apparently know who our presidential nominee for the Republican Party is. So we have Donald Trump. And is he at odds with the GOP? Is the GOP at odds with him? Is there going to be a reconciliation before we hit time to make this official?
Well, there definitely is a clash right now between what we'd call the party establishment. Leaders of the Republican Party, including the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, are not committed to endorsing Donald Trump at this point. And Donald Trump is sort of speaking to a group of non-traditional voters, people who probably didn't vote often, people who we wouldn't consider necessarily the base of the Republican Party. And so he is definitely running on an outsider platform, appealing to probably alienated and apathetic previous voters. And that worries the traditional GOP because he says things that could offend a large number of people and greatly impact not only their chances of taking back the White House, but potentially losing the Senate and maybe even the House.
With that being said, do you see the possibility of a contested primary as we head towards the Republican National Convention?
I would have said, had one of the candidates stayed in the race, that would have been more likely. But I do think when it's all said and done, the Republicans will unify around Donald Trump by the time of the convention because I don't think they'll have another choice.
Okay, and let's switch this over to the Democratic side. Bernie Sanders, hanging tough. Numbers would maybe say otherwise, but tell us, where are we at with this Democratic convention?
just like Trump is an outsider candidate, so too that's how Sanders is presenting himself, Bernie Sanders. Even though, of course, he's been in the political establishment for 20, 30 years now, he really, he was always an outsider in Congress, and now he's kind of applying that as well to his campaign. And so far, he's really won a lot of support of especially young people. There's almost every student in my class is all about Bernie. We have a lot of.
They feel the burn.
Yeah, they feel the burn. What can you do? And so we see a lot more young people involved in politics and in a way where they feel connected, where they really like his message because he's a democratic socialist, which is, previously socialism is a bad word in our society in America. But the youth of today seem to really jump on board with his ideas of more wealth equality, reduced or free tuition for college. A lot of his message really applies or seems to, go directly to their lives and how they live it. And so I think that wins him, good support as an outsider. Whereas Hillary is more of the establishment herself. She's worked in politics. She's been the Secretary of State. She's also been, a senator. She's more of the traditional Democratic base, the people that, have associated themselves as Democrats for quite some time now, who are a little bit more established in the party. And so we see kind of a disconnect there as well, that, we have the Bernie Sanders movement versus, the standard Democratic candidate of Hillary Clinton. So that will be interesting to see too, because although Hillary has taken in most of the primaries and is ahead in terms of delegate and superdelegate counts, Bernie's still in the race. He took Indiana a few days ago or a week ago.
West Virginia last night.
Yeah, took West Virginia last night. So I think he feels very motivated by the support that he has behind him to keep going, because otherwise it'd be kind of let down for them.
Yeah. Okay. Now, amongst some of the issues that we're going to talk about today, we'll try to hit a few of them if we can. One of the first that we'll talk about is healthcare. Discussions of whether or not to repeal Obamacare, to somehow change Obamacare. What do you think happens? Let's say we get to, a year from now. Where do we stand with Obamacare or healthcare in this country?
Well, it depends on who is in office. If let's assume Hillary Clinton is going to get the nomination for the Democratic Party. If Hillary Clinton is president, she has said that she supports Obamacare. Hillary, when she was the first lady in the 90s, supported universal health care.
Right.
So that is something that she would, I think, continue on. And then...
And the other side of it?
Well, if Donald Trump has made it clear that he's not very happy with the way Obama has run the government in general, and so he's made pledges that basically that healthcare would be privatized again. And although Obamacare has, of course, survived Supreme Court appeals and things like that, it doesn't mean it's safe from the next Congress, the next president, whoever decides that it's not necessarily good for the country. But you never know. We might see that we have constituents back home that are urging their congressmen to keep this because they have insurance for the first time, or there might be the constituents who say, I'm paying too much. My out-of-pocket expenses have doubled since Obamacare. So it's really, I think it's going to depend also on who has the support of the Congress and really which party's controlling which. So
I would add to that it is often difficult to try to repeal something that has already been put in place, and as Ms. Musil said, has been supported by the Supreme Court.
Right.
So.
Right. And that was kind of like their last chance to overthrow it, or whatever you want to say.
Great. Okay. Thank you. We'll be back shortly. Don't go anywhere. I'm Tom Dignan. This is TalkNado. Welcome back to TalkNado. I'm Tom Dignan. We are talking today with Ms. Musil, Mr. Fields, about current event issues, particularly as it pertains to the 2016 presidential election. So let's talk immigration. You mentioned this, Mr. Fields, in the opening as maybe the most important, element in this debate.
Yes. Well, Donald Trump has basically made a name for himself in this campaign through his immigration plan. He has said some controversial things that have both angered and have galvanized millions of Americans. He, among many things, supports mass deportations of the approximately 11 million undocumented immigrants living in the United States. He supports the construction of a wall between the southern border of the United States and Mexico that he believes Mexico will pay for. He also supports a ban on Muslims entering the country, and has also spoken out against allowing Syrian refugees. And so this has been very popular with, by and large, white men, and has been unpopular with the fastest growing group in the United States, Latinos. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out.
Yeah. And on the Democrat side, they're obviously going to be different than the Republicans, but they're going to be they want to have a much more lenient approach to immigration, continuing with some of Obama's actions, like the executive order that he passed that basically prioritizes criminals and other people that are breaking the law to be deported, and kind of taking the heat off of those who are paying their dues and working for a living in America. I believe that Clinton and Sanders both want to kind of continue these policies. They absolutely are eager to accept refugees because they know that our policy for accepting refugees is a very long, arduous process in which you are, everything about you is screened. All of your contacts are looked into, everything like that. So they say that allowing refugees in is part of being America because we've allowed so many immigrants in, and that our process is pretty thorough in making sure we don't allow in, terrorists or anyone else who's looking to disrupt the order of things. I know Obama himself has pledged to bring in more Syrian refugees than ever before. Even going as far as commenting on Humans of New York. When they did a whole thing on the Syrian refugees. Welcoming people and welcoming them to the White House. So the Democrats are definitely more of inclusion in that sense, but of course still attempting to close the border by making sure that we're not having people come over illegally, by allowing the citizenship process to become a little bit more attainable for those who are here and for those who potentially want to come here, so that the thought of sneaking in or not coming in illegally is kind of not as appealing of an option.
And one of Trump's claims is that aside from protecting jobs and keeping, he does think that, or claims it seems that part of this is to keep ISIS out.
Right.
And that's one plan of his attack.
Right.
Where does Trump stand with his sort of radical idea? He claims we're just going to wipe them out. How does that look?
Well, Donald Trump has spoken pretty aggressively on the war on terror. And he definitely worries that allowing Syrians or other Muslim immigrants could lead to things that happened in Europe, like in Paris, for example, where there were some incidences of ISIS members sneaking in into Europe. So I think that is a legitimate concern that Donald Trump has.
But it's also different. I mean, if you think about the borders of Europe versus America,
Yes,
it's much easier to sneak across a
right,
European border with a cloud of refugees than it is, elsewhere.
Absolutely. But Donald Trump also has spoken about being more aggressive in our bombing campaign of ISIS. He has mentioned on several occasions that kind of not going to let him breathe, and they're going to be, constantly be bombed. He has been a bit short on details in regards to how that differs from President Obama, because quite frankly, President Obama has had a pretty active bombing campaign of ISIS as well. So I wonder how he'll implement that. He has also talked about bringing back enhanced interrogation tactics to find suspected terrorists.
Waterboarding, things like
which
this.
has also caused some controversy. There's been, CIA members, generals saying they would not abide by that type of order.
Or even like the American Psychological Association saying that these tactics should not be used against people. They are torture. So there's plenty of groups speaking out.
But he is definitely speaking to a group of Americans that are concerned about national security, and he's striking a chord with those Americans.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so what does this look like on the Democratic side? I mean, they seem less. Their rhetoric is less inflammatory.
Right. And that's where I think we're kind of between a rock and a hard place in a lot of aspects in the Middle East, especially with ISIS, because most of ISIS's stronghold right now is in Syria, or at least in that area. And Syria, we're not currently, we don't recognize their government, Assad, because he's also fighting a civil war, and he uses chemical weapons and warfare against his own people. And so we are fighting ISIS, but not working with Assad. So it's very hard because we're intervening in a country without working with their government. And then we also have to deal with the fact that Russia is working with Assad to try to stop ISIS. So it's almost like these Cold War lines are being drawn in a weird way again. But it makes for, I think what all of the candidates understand is that it's very complicated. It's not something that you can just say, okay, bomb this area and then the problem's over. Because even if you are taking out their strongholds and their leaders and things like that, we still have around the world people being radicalized by ISIS,
including in the United States.
who like the message, who it appeals to. So it's more. It's not just fighting to defeat an army or a group of people, but it's kind of like hearts and minds. You're fighting for people to also believe that this is not the true form of Islam. This is not how Islam was meant to be practiced. Nothing of this relates to the peaceful religion of Islam. So went really far off on topic there, but really,
Well, and, you know,
it's a complicated situation. And I don't think that even if you have a plan as a candidate, until you get into office and you know the battle, it's hard to make a decision before you know all the, the battlefield.
Right, and we haven't mentioned North Korea, which was one of our talking points. And so, there are multiple fronts to this war on terror, and in even expanding it into just threats to the, to the American way of life is what Donald Trump was. I mean, do you see one of these areas as most important to Trump or the GOP?
I would always say the Middle East is going to be important.
Both.
The Korean Peninsula, Asia is obviously also an important strategic economic region. This is kind of going a little bit off, but Donald Trump has talked about changing our economic plans. Because he believes we have made bad deals with countries. And he thinks one of the ways that we can improve our standing in the world is to improve those negotiations. And that's where his expertise is. He wrote a book called The Art of the Deal. He knows how to make deals, and he's going to make better deals. And I think he believes that will also lead to a more secure, this kind of America first foreign policy.
Okay, we're going to come right back and continue this conversation with Mr. Fields and Ms. Musel. I'm Tom Dignan. This is TalkNado. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to TalkNado. I'm Tom Dignan. We're talking current events with Mr. Fields and Ms. Musel. So we left off, we were talking about international issues with security. Let's take things to the domestic side. Gun laws in particular are another hot button topic for this election. Republicans, where are they going to stand on this issue with concealed carry laws, gun laws in general?
Well, what's interesting is that Donald Trump's viewpoint has changed over the course of his life. So I'll speak to what he currently has said. Donald Trump has been in this election pro-gun rights, Second Amendment rights, believes that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to carry a firearm. He did mention after the Paris attacks that had every Parisian been armed, that may have reduced the number of fatalities. And so he would certainly support the direction the country is going, concealed carry, which is in all 50 states. He would be less likely to want to change the existing gun control laws. It's actually kind of interesting because that is a huge issue that you're not really hearing a ton on from the GOP, which I find that interesting. That's probably one of the most important issues most traditional Republicans would be talking about. But it's not something that's been focused on. It'll probably be something focused on more because there is a great disparity between Democrats and Republicans on that issue.
Yeah. Democrats in general are pro-gun control. And Hillary and Bernie in general are both wanting to have stricter gun control laws. I believe publicly they both said that they're pro-individual ownership.
Yeah, well, Bernie Sanders has been historically more on the Republican side.
Right, like libertarian, if people can, if you're trained and you know how to operate a gun, that's kind of your right. Hillary Clinton has always supported more gun control laws, whether that be closing loopholes that allow people on the no-fly list to get weapons, which, by the way, is still there, or making it so that the 3-day waiting period also includes a background check no matter what, and after 3 days, if the background check isn't done, too bad, still gotta wait. Yeah, closing the gun show loopholes, things like that, just trying to keep weapons out of the hands of those who are going to use them irresponsibly, to say the least. But we've really seen a big surge in gun control in America, and more of a favorable opinion of gun control laws, especially after more recent events, a few years back now, we have the events in
Newtown.
Newtown, thank you. And where we see horrible atrocities, with the theater shooting in Aurora, things like that, where it's commonplace now that we have a mass shooting. That really there's been a big push among the American people, Republican or Democrat, that we need more gun control laws, that we need to close loopholes and make sure that only responsible gun owners are the ones that have weapons. So it'll be interesting to see, because of the rise in public opinion about this issue, whether or not the candidates will reflect that in their policies, because Currently, it's all-time high in terms of
Right.
in favor of gun control.
And I would add to that perhaps a discussion on mental health
Absolutely.
in the United States and the role that plays in our gun laws, in mass shootings.
Right.
I think that's definitely an
It goes
issue
back to
that
healthcare. It goes,
Yeah,
that needs
absolutely.
to
all those
be
issues,
also
right.
brought in
Right.
in this election. The thing is that right now foreign policy is dominating the election cycle, but the news cycle changes constantly, and so
Absolutely.
domestic could become
Yeah.
more of an issue. So
Maybe when we get into the debates.
Right.
Well, that's what I was
becomes
going
a
to say. At
hot-button
what
issue.
point does that rhetoric change or that the lead change? Does that happen now as we get closer with Trump sort of taking the lead with the Republican Party? Are we going to see that sooner or later?
I think there'll be two factors. Either an international or domestic event happening can completely change the tone of
Absolutely.
the election. The terrorist attacks in Europe totally changed it towards security, which I think benefited Donald Trump in many ways.
Absolutely.
If there ends up being some sort of economic issue or some sort of domestic issue, then that could completely change kind of the conversation. So I think it really depends on events as they transpire. I think Donald Trump will try to focus on immigration and on ISIS as much as he can. And I think Hillary probably will try to focus more domestically.
And just in general, once the candidates have been decided, and this is always true, they start out very extreme, trying to get as many people to choose them. And then as they start to hit the general election and campaign for that, they start moving towards the middle. They become more moderate. So it might depend. Maybe that's a place where Donald Trump can get some of the Democratic voters is by bringing up a domestic issue and being somewhat moderate on it, or vice versa. So it just might depend on honestly, like what serves them best at the time in terms of an issue and how they can get the most people on their side with it.
There are going to be millions of Americans that can be courted
Yes.
on either side, and it's going to be interesting to see how the two candidates try to court those. You have a lot of young Americans who support Bernie but don't want to support Hillary.
Right.
You have a lot of moderate Republicans who don't want to support Donald Trump. So it'll be interesting how they try to, almost a
Absolutely.
chess match, and
Yeah.
how they try to court these different types of voters.
Is there one issue you see either side being able to bend a little more on? That's sort of a broad question. It's a tough one to answer.
I don't know. At this point, they're so polarized. It's
Right.
hard to say what they would be able to kind of come together on.
And barring some, as you said,
Some major
incidents.
unifying event
Right.
in America. I don't know.
I would say the last election, 2012, proved that if you do not get a certain number of Latino voters, it is difficult to win elections. I think Obama poll had 76% of Latinos voted for him. So Donald Trump, I think, has to figure out a way to appeal to some Latinos.
Okay,
Absolutely.
very quick question that we didn't talk about. Bernie Sanders seems to be the only one talking really about education, and it's his free public colleges for everyone.
Yes.
Without saying if it's possible, why is education being talked about by only one candidate primarily? Will that sort of spill over into more of the debates and conversation as we move forward?
It has to, because if we want young people to participate in our government and vote, then candidates have to speak to their needs. It's the number one debt in America now is student loan debt. It needs to be covered. I think that's one of the great appeals Bernie has had among young voters is that he's speaking to that issue. And so they're going to really have to if they want young people to be more interested. And I would say it would be a disservice to not discuss that.
Yeah, I agree.
Great. Thank you both very much for joining us today.
Thank you,
This was a
Mr.
very
Dignan.
lively discussion talking about the art of conversation. I'm Tom Dignan. For Mr. Fields and Ms. Musel, this has been TalkNado. Thank you very much, and please tune in next time.